Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our National Advocacy Conference. My name is Brian Frederick with the ALS Association. We're going to get started in about 10 minutes. We just wanted to jump on the line here and let you know that we have a great program for today. Make sure that our audio sounds good. So if you are having any audio issues, please let us know in the chat. You'll be able to chat your feedback and questions. And our speakers will get to your questions later. Looking forward to a great program today, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Hey everyone, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick here from Pennsylvania's 1st District, and I'm honored to speak with you today as a co-chair of the House of Representatives ALS Caucus. Representatives Crow, Sewell, Calvert, and I first created the ALS Caucus in 2019 with the mission of forming a bipartisan coalition aimed at collaborating on ALS-centric legislation. Since then, the caucus has grown to more than 150 members from both sides of the aisle in both the House and the Senate. And we are proud to partner and work with the ALS Association and many different ALS advocacy groups. And as the co-chair of the ALS Caucus, it is a priority for me to ensure that legislation is passed that takes care of and protects our ALS community. Last year, my colleagues and I, along with other members of Congress, co-sponsored the Accelerating Access to Critical Therapies for ALS Act. I was an original co-sponsor and a strong advocate for the bill's passage. This legislation, which was signed by President Biden in December, will help fund ALS research and the development of new drugs and treatments to combat ALS and the disease's underlying symptoms. The past 2 years have been incredibly difficult for everyone, but the pandemic has given us a much-needed increase in the availability and access to telehealth services. It has shown how vital and significant these services are, and I'm proud to co-sponsor legislation, for example, the Telehealth Extension Act of 2021, which expands telehealth initiatives and access and extends its coverage under Medicare. So your work as advocates for ALS research and funding go a long way, and they are greatly appreciated. I wanted you all to know that. It might be hard to see the results sometimes, but your hard work and passion in solving problems does make a difference and is essential to the well-being of our democracy and the causes that we're fighting for, including ALS research. So I want to thank you for your commitment to this cause and encourage you to continue to educate others on ALS and advocate for yourselves, for your loved ones, and others within our ALS community. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome back to day 2, or should I say maybe day 1.5 of the 2022 National ALS Association's Virtual Advocacy Conference. First, I want to sincerely apologize for the technical challenges that we had yesterday. I know it was frustrating for our team, frustrating for you, and frustrating for everyone involved. We worked really hard with the vendor to try to fix the technical challenges, but eventually we're unable to. So thank you for joining us again today. The good news is that we're going to add all of the programming from yesterday to the end of today and the end of tomorrow. That means we'll go a little bit longer today, probably until around 5:30 Eastern Time. If you want to stick around to see the added programming, that would be great. If you're unable to stay, that's okay. We're going to make the recordings available very soon after the conference, and you can watch them whenever it's convenient for you. So one thing I wanted to mention that I mentioned yesterday, but you might have been unable to hear, was the news that we have recently heard out of Canada. And I think many of you, if not everyone, has heard that Health Canada has approved AMX 0035 for our Northern Canadian friends living with ALS. And that is fantastic news for our friends to the north. And we are now even more resolved to ensure that Americans living with ALS can also access AMX 0035. I promise you, we are going to keep pushing FDA. I'm so grateful to all of you who have helped along the way, and I hope you'll continue with us on this journey as we work with FDA to get across that finish line. Our community has sent over 7,500, that's amazing, individual emails to the FDA, and that number continues to rise. So please keep on that pressure. We will too. This campaign on AMX 0035 really has been in the works for almost 2 years at this point, and the community has been united this entire time. And that really speaks to the power of advocacy and a united voice. We're all moving the FDA, and we will get this done. So speaking of someone who knows the power of advocacy, I would now like to introduce someone that is very special to us. She sits on our National Board of Trustees and also is the Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer for AARP, Nancy Lamont. Nancy, would you like to say a few words?
Thanks, Colleen, and welcome everybody to either day one or day two of the 2022 National ALS Virtual Advocacy Conference. I'm delighted to be here. Some of you know me. For 6 years, my adult sons and I, and a set of devoted care workers, helped my husband live with ALS in our home. He died around Christmas time in 2019, and we vowed then that we would help in some small way people like us live with this very tough disease. Kalani gave you a little bit of my background. You probably know that expression, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if your day job is, as mine is, to run AARP's extensive nationwide advocacy operation, then it's probably not surprising to you that I see advocacy as absolutely central to achieving the ALS Association's strategic goals. Finding a cure and treatments, helping people live a better quality of life will be achieved in large part by how successful we are as advocates. We need more funding for research. We need a vibrant and well-informed FDA to review and approve drugs. We need the Social Security Administration to move quickly on SSDI claims. We need support for clinics. We need CMS to pay for drugs, to offer telehealth and other assistive technology services, and to support family caregivers like many of you and me. And we need much more. And so we need to be world-class advocates. Some days it's hard to see progress in our current political environment of vitriol, gridlock, and partisanship, and it's very easy to be cynical. But things are getting done at both the federal and state levels, and we can only make progress on our agenda if all of us, you and I individually and collectively, bring the stories, the challenges, voices, and faces of ALS patients and their families to policymakers. Every single visit, every phone call, every email, every connection matters. And that's why this conference is so important. Thank you all for everything you've done to date. And I urge you to spend more time today to hone your message, and even more of that beyond this week. Respond to requests for you to engage. Take the time that admittedly most of us just don't have, to act. Like this disease, our activism and our advocacy must be unrelenting. So with that, thanks again for all you do, and back to Colleen.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for sharing your story and how we met, and I think in a way that most people would prefer not to meet, but I really enjoyed our relationship together. And as you all could see, Nancy has some really great expertise to share with our community and with the association and the work that we do. So thank you for your time and efforts. I'm now going to turn the program over to Dr. Neil Thacker, who's our Chief Mission Officer. Neil is going to share a few thoughts about today's program and kind of give us the lay of the land for the next couple of hours. Neil, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Colleen. I wanted to, first, if we can go to the slides, thank our sponsors. If we can go to the next slide. So I'd like to thank Amylyx, Apellis, Biogen, Biohaven, Cytokinetics, Genentech, Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma, Sanofi, and Tranquis Therapeutics. And if we go to the next slide, PTC Therapeutics, sorry, I'm switching my feeds here so I can see the right slide. Soleo Health, Clean, and Promobile. Their support of this conference is really important. As you know, this is a critically important conference to the ALS community. It's vital that we communicate our message clearly to the government to talk about what it is that we're trying to do, what's important to us. So if you can go to the next slide. And of course, what we're looking for is a fundamental transformation in the experience of having ALS until we can find a cure. And that needs to be happening very, very quickly. Speed is important here. And so I'll be talking about this in more detail at the end of the day. This is part of the message that we were discussing yesterday. But there are really three key parts to this. The first is we need new treatments and cures. And part of the advocacy role is making sure our government supports clinical trials make sure that it's supporting research that has a focus to it, an impact, and a timeline to it. That we have to optimize the treatments and care that we have today. We have to not only improve the state of the art and keep the ceiling raising, and so everyone is getting better care, but we have to make sure people can get that care, that care is delivered, that it's affordable and it's accessible. We also need to make sure that the assistive technology that people have to help people communicate and move around and interact with the world is as good as it can be. And there's a complex set of research questions and coverage questions that are we need to address as an ALS community. And then finally, we need to think about the harms that come with ALS, not just the disease itself, but the infections, the pain, the psychosocial stress, and the financial pressures can be avoided or delayed, and if possible, to even avoid the disease itself. For the folks who share the risk factors that you may have, family members, people you served with who may share genetic risk factors or environmental risk factors. We were hoping to go through these one at a time and have speakers to support each theme. But because of the complexity of dealing with elected officials and clinicians, and of course some of our internet challenges, we're going to be doing things as a bit of a buffet. So some of our conversations are going to be hitting on one theme, and then we're going to switch and start talking about another theme. And we'll be trying to guide you all through that. So along the first theme, which is finding new treatments and cures, if you can go to the next slide. As Colleen alluded to, we're in the middle of a really important question that the FDA is facing about whether to approve or not approve this Amylyx drug, AMX 0035. We've been talking to you about this since the first peer-reviewed paper came out in 2020. We think it's ready to go. Canada thinks it's ready to go. The FDA has decided they need an additional 3 months. This is an important drug because not only is it one of the first drugs coming out of the ice bucket, but all of the tests have been on top of the existing ALS treatments that are available. So there's the potential for this drug to work in combination with what's out there. And then hopefully other drugs can come along and work in combination with this drug as well. So we're starting to build a number of incremental treatments that work together and hopefully start to change the course of the disease quickly. If you go to that QR code, if you hold your phone up to it, it'll take you to a link where you can send a letter to the FDA, or you can copy the link from down below and send your letter to the FDA asking them to approve AMX 0035. So far, I believe almost 8,000 of you have already sent in these letters. They're important, and that was even before Canada had announced its decision. So that's a call to action. I think we'll be coming back to it. I want to just talk to you about what will be happening for the rest of the day. If you go to the next slide, please. We're going to have a conversation with Dr. Benatar, and I'll introduce him in a moment. We're going to be talking about some of the new things that we're planning for state advocacy. That's an expansion of our advocacy program at the association, and I'm looking forward to that. We're going to hear from Dr. Bedlack, who many of you know, talking about multidisciplinary care, the importance of telehealth, and then more detail from me about our 2030 plan, this idea to make ALS a livable disease very quickly. And also to end out the day, just an overview of our legislative agenda. So I'd like to introduce you, if we can go to the next slide, please, to our first speaker for the day, Dr. Michael Benatar. He's the executive director of the ALS Center and the chief of the neuromuscular division in the Department of Neurology at the University of Miami. He leads the pre-symptomatic familial ALS study, the PREFALS study, which he started in 2007 in the CREATE Consortium, which is I think 35 center network on therapy development for ALS and related disorders. He also has recently joined our board of trustees and is now the chair of our research committee. And he's going to talk about his work and how it's helping us think about ways to reduce the harms of ALS. And so, Dr. Benatar, thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Neil. Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you today, and I very much appreciate the invitation, and I'm honored to speak at annual ALS Advocacy Day and to talk to you about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart and the progress that we're making as a community towards ALS prevention. I do want to start out just with my disclosures. I do some consulting to assist companies developing therapies for ALS. The University of Miami has licensed some of our research data, including some of that I will talk about today. And I serve as an investigator in industry trials, and we have a provisional patent that's pending around some of this work. So what I'd like to cover in the next 15 minutes is I would like to start by making the case for early treatment. Why is this so important? I then want to talk about the critical pieces of the puzzle if we want to make meaningful progress towards delaying the onset or even preventing ALS. And I'm going to start out with studying pre-symptomatic ALS in the genetically at-risk population as a starting point. I'll talk to you a little bit about neurofilaments as biomarkers of pre-symptomatic ALS and how that's led us to what's now ongoing very excitingly as the first pre-symptomatic ALS clinical trial. And then I'll end off with some broader relevance to the general ALS population, including those not at genetic risk, as well as what I see as some of our research priorities for the coming years. So, to make the case for early treatment, I want you to think about disease along a continuum. And here is symptom onset. And as you all know, it takes some time before a diagnosis is made. And I'm using this term clinically manifest to describe the clinical syndrome of ALS that we're all familiar with. And as we all know, there is about, unfortunately, a diagnostic delay of around 12 months between symptom onset and diagnosis. And this is due to many things, but that delay in diagnosis is one of the reasons why there's often a delay in treatment. But even after a diagnosis is made, typically people don't get onto a treatment or into a clinical trial immediately. Eligibility criteria might permit up to a year or 18 months or 2 or 3 years of symptom duration. And on average, this amounts to another 17 months of delay. So a long delay from symptom onset to when we're initiating therapies. This is compounded by the idea that before symptoms begin, the disease process might have begun. And so I want to differentiate in your minds when disease begins and when symptoms begin. And there is this pre-symptomatic period. And if we add this pre-symptomatic period, the diagnostic delay, this intervention delay, there's a long delay before treatments are initiated. And what I'll talk to you about today is how do we intervene during this period here? So if we want to delay the onset or prevent ALS, we really need to understand something about the causes and the risk factors for ALS. But we also need a window of opportunity to intervene among people at risk before the disease becomes clinically apparent. One of the challenges is that ALS can begin at any age. And so what we need are tools that help us predict when clinical disease is likely to emerge so that we know when is the best time to intervene to prevent ALS. And obviously we need promising therapeutic strategies that are safe and show promise of efficacy and that it makes sense to bring to people who are at risk for disease before they show any signs of disease. So let's sort of dig into this a little bit, and we'll start with the genetic form of ALS. And we started here because the genetic population is really the only population that we know to be at significantly elevated risk for ALS and yields us an opportunity to study pre-symptomatic disease because we can identify gene mutation carriers and follow them before they develop any clinical evidence of ALS. And so this is what led us to launch the PREFAL study, the pre-symptomatic familial ALS study about 15 years ago. This is a longitudinal natural history and biomarker study. And as I've alluded, it enrolls people who carry a gene mutation as the population at significantly elevated risk for ALS. And the goals of this have been to develop biomarkers of pre-symptomatic disease, to develop predictors of when symptomatic disease is coming, and really to prepare for a future of prevention trials. And I like to sort of use this quick summary to say, although the pre and pre-FALS technically stands for pre-symptomatic, this is very much about predicting when disease will come and preparing for what we hope is an imminent future now of being able to prevent ALS, or at least some forms of ALS. So I've alluded to this idea, and these are some data. I could have picked many publications, but just to illustrate the point that there's a broad range in age of onset of ALS. And even amongst people who are at genetic risk, they might carry a gene that puts them at risk that they've had since birth. But disease may begin when they're 20, when they're 50, when they're 70, or never. And so if we're wanting to intervene before disease becomes apparent, depending on how safe that treatment is and how it's administered, we don't want to have to administer it for 30 or 40 or 50 years. We may do more harm than good. So we need to know when to intervene. So what we need then are predictors of clinical onset. And we've seen that pre-symptomatic biomarkers are the things that yield us the most hope to identify these predictors. So to tell you about what I think is the most promising one of these, I have to introduce you to neurofilaments, even though I'm sure you know something about these. So here's a caricature of a nerve cell. This is the cell body. Here's the axon. And when the axon or the nerve is injured, neurofilaments, which are these major structural components of nerves, they're released into the spinal fluid. They get into the blood. There are different forms of them. I'm going to focus mostly on neurofilament light. And importantly, we've got good tools to reliably measure these. So what do we know about neurofilaments before clinical disease becomes apparent? So again, this is in a population at genetic risk. On this axis, I'm plotting the amount of neurofilament that's being released. On this axis, the time to or from clinical onset of disease, and time 0 is symptom onset. And you'll see amongst people with an SOD1 mutation, a FUS mutation, these colored circles show you elevated neurofilament within the 6 to 12 months before clinical disease becomes apparent. So what we've learned is that neurofilament increases in the months to years before phenoconversion. That's a term we use to describe the transition to clinical disease. And neurofilament continues to increase in the 6 to 12 months following phenoconversion. But importantly, it's not just, excuse me, that NFL is a biomarker of pre-symptomatic disease. We think that we can use it to predict the timing of clinically manifest disease. So here's the schema. Here's pre-symptomatic disease. Here's symptomatic disease. And we're plotting on this rise in neurofilament as a biomarker that happens during pre-symptomatic and the early symptomatic stage of ALS. And what we found is that the level of neurofilament predicts when clinically manifest disease will occur. So we've been able to do this, especially amongst carriers of highly penetrant mutations in SOD1, and know with a high degree of confidence, a low false positive rate, a low false negative rate, so not many errors, we can predict when disease is coming. So we've been able to use this then to begin to explore therapeutic strategies before clinical disease becomes apparent. And our initial efforts have focused on SOD1 therapeutics because the therapeutic landscape is most advanced for this genetic form of ALS. So this has led us to the design of the ATLAS trial. And I'll talk a little bit about this. The objective of this study is to evaluate whether pre-symptomatic initiation of an SOD1 antisense nucleotide, or an ASO, this is a form of a gene therapy, whether this can delay the emergence of clinically manifest ALS or slow the decline in function. Even if we can't prevent disease and it still appears, can we massively slow it down? And we will look at the proportion of people who develop disease within 12 months of randomization. And these are people we'll enroll who carry a gene mutation, who don't have any signs of disease, and they'll be randomized to get treatment once their neurofilament levels go up, but they're still pre-symptomatic. So let me show you what the study looks like. There's a natural history run-in phase where we simply monitor neurofilament levels monthly in the blood. If neurofilament levels go up and people are still pre-symptomatic, they get randomized to drug or placebo. If they do develop clinically manifest ALS, then immediately they get access to open label drug. We also recognize that some people may develop disease without a rise in neurofilament, and they too will go on to open label drug. So the important thing here is that the latest anybody gets the active drug is at the point that clinical disease emerges, but we're going to be able to test the idea that if we treat before disease begins, could we actually prevent it? So How do we then take what we've learned from this space in the genetic forms of ALS, and what are the windows of opportunity to study non-genetic ALS and to bring these lessons to help us advance ALS prevention in the broader population? So to do this, I want to bring you back to this schema. And I've spoken to you about pre-symptomatic ALS and symptomatic or clinically manifest disease. And the assumption until now has been that this pre-symptomatic period is clinically silent, and all we have are biomarker evidence of disease. One of the things that we've learned is that this is probably not true. What we've learned is within pre-symptomatic disease, there's also a prodromal period, what we've called mild motor impairment or MMI. There's also a cognitive version, MCI, or a behavioral version, MBI, and that this clinical prodrome exists before clinical ALS becomes readily apparent. And we think this gives us a unique opportunity to study pre-symptomatic disease and to think about the possibility of ALS prevention, even in the non-genetic population. And let me try to share some experience from other disease areas, which gives me hope for this. Before I do, let me just tell you what I mean by mild motor impairment. I see this as a clinical syndrome characterized by symptoms, signs, or findings on EMG that are indicate motor impairment. These are abnormal, but they're insufficient in severity or extent to permit confidence that clinically manifest ALS has emerged. I see this as an intermediate or transitional stage between being unaffected and being developing clinical ALS, but it's also an indeterminate state that may or may not reflect ALS, and so it requires referral, evaluation, and diagnostic workup to determine the likely cause. We think that this is apparent in most, probably all genetic forms of ALS, and our hypothesis, but we need to study this more, is that this occurs in all forms of ALS. The duration of this prodrome may last from months to years and varies between people. And importantly, in some people, mild cognitive impairment or mild behavioral impairment, MCI or MBI, may also be prodromal to ALS and may accompany or exist alone without MMI. So how is this relevant? If we looked at the Parkinson's world, Parkinson's, like ALS, has some genetic causes, but is largely a non-genetic disease. And the Parkinson's world has identified a plethora of clinical markers that define a prodromal state. These are things like REM sleep behavior disorder, a loss of sense of taste, a loss of sense of smell. And these are markers that really enable the Parkinson's world, even without genetic markers, to identify people up to 10 years before the development of clinical Parkinson's disease, and to advance the field of trying to intervene early and to prevent Parkinson's. This approach has also been key in Alzheimer's, where we've learned that earlier detection by recognizing mild cognitive impairment as a prodromal state to Alzheimer's is permitting earlier therapeutic intervention. And really much of the therapeutic efforts at the moment in Alzheimer's are targeting this earlier stage of disease. And so we see this as an analogy, MMI and ALS, as a unique opportunity to advance our field in the same way. So what then are the research priorities? We really need dedicated research efforts to identify other, not just genetic, but also importantly, non-genetic risk factors for ALS. We have a window of opportunity and we need systematic longitudinal studies of those that are at elevated risk for ALS. People with MMI, but there are other groups as well. Those with FTD or other disorders related to ALS, family members of people with ALS, perhaps those with an elevated neurofilament, veterans, and other populations at elevated risk. We also need new predictors of clinical onset. So we need discovery of novel biomarkers, including those that reflect the underlying biology of this disease. So not just the neurofilaments that reflect axonal injury, but perhaps markers of TDP-43 pathology or other markers of the biology of disease. And we also need to identify if they exist other clinical markers of prodromal disease. And then obviously we need therapeutic strategies. We need research to understand the biological mechanisms that underpin ALS and to develop therapies that target these mechanisms so that we can then bring them to bear in the at-risk populations before disease emerges. So let me wrap up. I think that the road to ALS prevention began with the meticulous study of pre-symptomatic disease among those at genetic risk for ALS. But the natural history and the biomarker data that we've learned from this population have been critical to the design and implementation of the first trial in pre-symptomatic ALS, but also in identifying the first clinical marker of prodromal disease, this entity MMI. And as I've said, I think this is the opportunity to study people at risk for all forms of ALS. I think that insights from genetic ALS will inform the research approaches that we need to studying pre-symptomatic disease in non-genetic ALS. And if we're right that the earliest treatment is the best treatment, then even though the path forward is enormously challenging, I think it's imperative that we go down this path. And so lastly, I just want to stop and finish with some acknowledgements and acknowledge the participants in our studies and their families, my group at the University of Miami, especially my colleague Joanne Wu, who runs our program with me and without whom this work would not be possible. Those who participated in our first pre-symptomatic ALS workshop to help us think through these issues. Some long-standing collaborators, Dr. Malaspina, Dr. Anderson, Christine Stanislaw, our colleagues at Biogen who've helped and are working with us on the ATLAS study, as well as obviously all our funding agencies. And I'll stop there, and I'm pleased to see I've left time for some questions and hopefully lively discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Dr. Benatar. My name is Jeremy Holden. I am the Director of News and Engagement at the ALS Association and also the host of the Connecting ALS podcast. And I will be here moderating all of the Q&A sessions this week. So with that, let's dig in. Dr. Benatar, people clearly paying attention to your question. So let's start with one, or to your presentation. So let's start with one, a really good one, I think. What is being done to better the clinical tools to diagnose ALS? Are any being developed? What's the status? And what funding is needed to pursue research for such tools?
So that's a great set of questions. I'm going to try to touch them. If I miss any parts, please come back and remind me. So I think, one of the biggest challenges is that people develop symptoms and it's not clear to the individual with symptoms or the physician that they go to see what this might represent. And so it takes a long time for somebody to get to see a clinical neurologist who knows something about ALS and is able to recognize it as such and to make that diagnosis. And so the reason I think we've struggled to shorten that diagnostic delay is this is a societal problem in medicine. We fundamentally need to get people to the right specialist earlier. So I think there's several strategies to this. The one is I think we need a public education campaign. We all know that if somebody says, I've got crushing substernal chest pain, that probably represents a heart attack and you should go to the emergency room, right? If people develop painless progressive weakness, they should perhaps be inquiring about this and seeing a neurologist. But I think what we need, perhaps an MMI gives us an example of trying to recognize a clinical syndrome that is milder, potentially prodromal, that requires referral and evaluation. At the moment, when we try to develop diagnostic tests, we're often working with a population that already has ALS. So by that time, we know they have ALS, so we don't need a diagnostic test. Diagnostic tests may work well in that population. What we need are tests that work well in people in whom we're unsure whether they have disease. And to do that, we need to see people and study them much earlier in the course of disease. The funding that's necessary, we need to put together those cohorts. We need to fund the studies to evaluate them, to develop the biomarker tools, and then to move those forward into their clinical utility. So I hope I touched on the various aspects of that question, but we could be here all day talking about those. Very important.
Such as life. And as we learned, you have important things to do. Two questions here wrapped in one. Early treatment for FALS is very important. How do we raise awareness among frontline physicians that will generally see a person with potential ALS? What is the status of the NFL data with FDA reviewers?
So NFL data, well, let me back up. So NFL as a marker of prodromal disease or early disease is not with the FDA for review. The FDA has a whole separate process for biomarker qualification. Again, that could be a whole seminar on its own. And when you approach that possibility, we have to explore that based on the potential usefulness of that as a test. In actual fact, we are engaged in those discussions at the moment, and we hope to move that forward to establish NFL as something useful, either in the clinic, but importantly as a research tool. So I hope to be able to give an update on that perhaps next year, but that's certainly work that's moving forward. But I think there was a second part to your question about the general neurologist. Can you remind me what that was?
Yeah. Sorry, I hit you with two here. But yeah, so how do we raise awareness? So early treatment for ALS is very important, right? How do we raise awareness among frontline physicians that will generally first see a person with potential ALS?
I don't know that I have a good answer. I think part of it is education, and it's not just about ALS. It's about the other things that might look like ALS and that it's not. I think if you think about all the people who present to a primary care doctor or a general neurologist, most of the complaints that might eventually turn out to represent ALS don't, or aren't ALS. So we have to think that they have to get those other diagnoses right as well. So I think one of the ways is to build capacity, so that if we encourage the general neurologist to think about this, they've got an easy route of referral in to see an ALS specialist. Currently, the bar is high because waiting times are long, and so it's hard. I think one of the things we can do is, together with that education campaign, is lower the bar by building capacity.
Another question about access to clinical trials. Are your studies thus far only for persons that have been identified as having ALS in the early stages?
No. So, across our research program, we study healthy controls, people at genetic risk for ALS, family members, people with early disease, people with late disease. We adopt an all-comer approach because I think everybody has something to contribute to helping us understand this disease. Right now, the clinical trial landscape, so treatment trials, focuses almost exclusively on the affected population. The ATLAS study is the first study in ALS that I'm aware of that is trying to treat people before the emergence of clinical disease. And I hope we'll see a future of more of these, but we need more biomarkers, we need more risk factors, and we need more treatment strategies that target that underlying biology.
We're scrolling through all these great questions. Can you analyze blood samples from patients outside of the named university partners?
That depends what you want to analyze for. So some things are sort of clinically available, and research tools, as they become validated, move into sort of the clinical realm. So neurofilaments are beginning to move in that direction, for example. But of course, there are many things that we're yet to discover how to measure, that we're still figuring out how to measure them. And those are typically only done through research studies because that technology is still being developed.
Well, so many more questions that I could get to, but we are unfortunately running short on time. Dr. Benatar, thanks again so much for your time and for all of your insight that you were able to share with us today.
Great. Thank you so much.
And now let's hear a quick message from Congressman Ken Calvert.
Hi, this is Congressman Ken Calvert. As co-chair of the House ALS Caucus, I've been inspired by the tireless advocacy of the ALS community. Thanks to your efforts, we were able to pass the Act for ALS legislation. Now more funding
He's muted. Can we restart?
Is on the way. By working together, we will end ALS.
And now I'm happy to welcome Melanie Lendenal, Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy, who will be joined by Senator David Tomassoni, a longtime member of the Minnesota Senate. He was diagnosed with ALS last year and recently championed successful passage of a bill to secure $25 million for ALS research and caregiver support. Representative Ann New Brindley is a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives. She lost her husband to ALS in 2016 and helped champion the ALS bill in Minnesota, ensuring caregiver support was funded. And Mary Ann Kuhn, the Managing Director of Care Services for the North Central Territory of the ALS Association.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. As Jeremy mentioned, my name is Melanie Lendenal. I'm the new Senior Vice President of Advocacy for the ALS Association, and I cannot tell you how excited I am to be here at the association and to be here with all of you today. As you know, we're here today to talk about this Minnesota bill that passed into law just a few months ago. And for all of you who are here with us today, as you know, this is the largest amount of money that a state has ever provided specifically for ALS research and caregiver support. So first, let me just say congratulations to all three of you on making this happen. Second, I think most of us are thinking the same thing right now, which is, how could I do this in my state? So Marianne, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. Tell us just a little bit, if you can, about how this all happened.
Thanks, Melanie. Appreciate that. And yeah, we are very excited for all that took place in Minnesota this year. There are a lot of things that went into making this happen. First, we were really fortunate to have strong legislative champions. You'll hear from Senator Tomassoni and Representative New Brindley, but we also had Senator Bach and Representative List-Lagarde, among many others. They really took this work to their colleagues and inspired them to do what they could to pass this bill. It was also, though, important, I think, to note that it was helped because families over the years were willing to share their personal stories. They were willing to educate their own legislators about what ALS meant to them, how it impacted them. And so when these bills came forward, we already had legislators in Minnesota who understood ALS and who understood the critical need for it. So it didn't happen overnight, but if we're being completely honest, I will say the reason that this happened, and you mentioned it a little bit, is because a long-term senator who was diagnosed with ALS determined early on that he was going to use his work in the Minnesota legislature to leave a truly lasting impact for families who are affected by ALS. And I would love for all of you to hear from the real champion behind all of this, and that is Senator David Tomassoni.
It started in my left hand, little things. I would drop a pen or a straw. I didn't think anything of it, just thought I wasn't paying attention. Then it was loss of control of my emotions, crying in instances where I never would have cried in the past, like at the end of a chick flick, or like crying after the Minnesota Wild won the hockey game after an incredible comeback. I am supposed to be a big, tough hockey player. I can't be crying at a hockey game. Slurring my words was next, then trouble turning down my shirt collar and buttoning my shirt. When I noticed that I had lost 10 pounds and it wasn't coming off my belly and I couldn't lift my 20-pound dumbbell, I finally decided to seek medical advice. After 2.5 months of doctor visits, an EMG revealed that I had ALS. That was June 2nd of 2021, which is not only the day Lou Gehrig died, but also the day that my dad died. Needless to say, I am not fond of June 2nd. In September, I was still driving, dressing myself, and feeding myself. By January, I couldn't do any of them. The legislative session began on January 31st. We introduced 2 bills, one for $20 million for research and one for the same $20 million plus $5 million for caregivers. It was amazing how things came together. In the only legislature in the country that is divided, Senate controlled by Republicans and the House controlled by Democrats, we were able to pass both the $20 million for research and the $5 million for caregivers. $25 million for ALS. Pretty amazing. In my 30 years in the legislature, I don't remember a bill spending that much money passing so early in the legislative session. The vote in the Senate was unanimous, and there were only 9 dissenting votes in the House of Representatives. Dr. David Walk, University of Minnesota ALS researcher, called it a game changer. Hopefully, this bill will encourage other states to do similar research. Hopefully, this brings hope and results to people afflicted with ALS. For far too long, there's been little to no progress finding a cure. We have to mount an all-out research attack on this insidious disease. No one should have to suffer any longer from ALS. There's so many people to thank. Governor Walz, Speaker Melissa Hortman, Senate Majority Leader Jeremy Miller, Senator Tom Bach, Senator Karen Housley, Representative David Lesselgard, Representative Anu Brindley, Kent Herbeck, Terry Steinbach, David Colquist, Chris Engler, Phil Griffin, ALS Minnesota, and all of my colleagues in the Minnesota legislature. I am so grateful to all of them and to the people who developed the technology like the eye gaze computer, which allows me to communicate. Without it, I would not have been able to participate in the legislative session this year, nor would I be here with you today. Finally, I have to thank my caregivers. Of them, my sons Dante and Danny, their spouses Tiffany and Anna, my sister Mary Jo and husband Richard, and all the people who have been so generous with their time, prayers, flowers, money, and cards. I'm eternally grateful. As Winston Churchill once said, never give up, never, never give up. That has to be our mantra. Thank you all for your tireless advocacy for a noble cause, and thank you for allowing me to speak to you today.
And thank you, Senator Tomassoni, for being an inspiration to all of us. We are so grateful to have you here with us today. And this is a question now for Representative New Brindley. You've been involved in state legislative work for a long time. You've sponsored many pieces of legislation. Tell me a little bit about what was different about this journey for this bill for you.
Well, certainly it was different for me, but honestly, it was different for the legislature, I think. Rarely do we have a situation where one of our own is affected in such a tangible, real way. And Senator Tomassoni, I'm sure, would be very humble about this, but he is something of a legend in Minnesota politics. And he is tenacious. He knows how to get things done. And so I don't think it was any surprise to anyone that when he was diagnosed with ALS, he chose to use this opportunity to advance this legislation. And frankly, I was just fortunate and blessed to be able to kind of be along for the ride and sort of advocate for the caregiver piece of this. Certainly, it was clearly a very personal piece of legislation for me. I lost my own husband almost 6 years ago to ALS after living with ALS for 3 years. So certainly it was very personal for me and difficult. Sometimes we talk about issues being ripe and sort of we're ready to legislate on an issue. And unfortunately, in this situation, that came about because of our friend, Senator Tomassoni, and seeing what ALS was doing in real time to him. It just made the need much more clear to all of us, to all of our legislative colleagues. And I'm so grateful that we use this opportunity to do really good work in advancing both the research funding and the caregiver funding.
Well, thank you for that. And I think this question is for all three of you now. So as you were all working on getting this bill through the legislature, were there things that people said or maybe did that you saw that really resonated, that really made an extra bit of a difference with your colleagues, Representative New Brindley and Senator Tomassoni, when they started hearing some of these things?
Would you like me to go first? and Senator Tomassoni can work on his eye gaze while I speak for a moment. I would say, just from my perspective, something that was really important to me as the legislation began advancing, Senator Tomassoni noted that there were two separate pieces of legislation. And as that began to advance, it was the research portion that was advancing without the caregiver support. And for me, that was such a critical piece of this, knowing how important that was. And I was very grateful for the people who engaged in press conferences and speaking with legislators. You know, we held a press conference with quite a few people involved, some of them currently living with ALS, some caregivers who had lost family. And I think that those voices were really critical, that it wasn't just me as a legislator, but it was other families and other sort of constituents of these legislators who were seeing these stories, to really sort of drive home the importance and the impact of what that funding could do.
Thank you for that. And Marianne, I know you're no stranger to the Minnesota legislature. You've been there since what, 2003? Mm-hmm. So, you know, what did you see that was different, that resonated in a different way when it came to working on this piece of legislation?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I should give credit to Representative New Brindley and Senator Tomassoni, because the fact, one, that they were willing to share their stories so publicly and be honest about how ALS had impacted them and was impacting them was huge. I think the other piece that really came to be, you know, Senator Tomassoni mentioned Dr. Walk, having neurologists being willing to come and share what research is in a way that makes it very understandable and also really critically expresses the need for it. And then the families, you know, we had so many people that were willing to come. We had, I think, 600 plus families that wrote emails to their own elected officials to say, please support this. All of those things made such a critical difference. But it was those real, honest conversations to me that made a difference. Because then it really became not a bill, but a story. And it was about real people being impacted. And to me, that was what was most critical and what really drove this across the finish line.
I think that's really great insight for all of us, not just a bill, but also a story. Mm-hmm. So I guess the next question for Marianne and Representative New Brindley, I'd love to hear from you as well, is what comes next now that this landmark piece of legislation is passed?
Go ahead,
yeah,
Marianne.
And I can, oh, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, I wanted to make sure, Senator Tomassoni, if you had anything that you had wanted to say previously.
They were telling us that they were totally supportive and willing to help. It was totally bipartisan and great advocacy.
Thank you. Yeah, I can certainly share what's happening from the ALS Association and then Representative New Brindley, if you wanted to add in. What comes next? A lot of work, a lot of really good work, I hope. We are going to continue to work with the department agencies who are overseeing this funding. And our goal is really to take comments from the community, to listen to families that we are working with so we can make sure those right messages go forward, that we are sharing what are the really critical things that are needed from a caregiver standpoint. We're going to continue to work with our clinics so that they can move the best research ideas forward. And in addition, you know, we are going to continue the awareness within the Minnesota legislature, whether it is pursuing smaller sustained funding or legislation that makes navigating ALS easier. We plan to capitalize on this win, making sure that we can keep ALS front and center in Minnesota, because we know everything is going to have to come together to help make ALS a livable disease. And that is our focus.
I would add, you know, obviously as legislators, we have a responsibility to our constituents. And I think that is twofold in this situation. One, we have an opportunity. One of the things I've thought about for a long time with diseases like ALS is that they're somewhat rare. I mean, it's not a disease where you know 20 people who have gone through this. But because of that, it doesn't get the attention or the funding that other diseases get. And I think that that's probably has a lot to do with the lack of advancement we have on the research side. So I think that there really is a public good to public funding for continued research because of that, because it's just an illness that does not get the attention that others do. The other piece of this for me, as somebody who was a caregiver, it's really important to me to continue some of that funding. I sing the praises of the ALS Association here in Minnesota every chance I get for the things that they do to take care of caregivers. I mean, probably primarily with all of the equipment loans. Marianne and I were talking yesterday, and she brought up, learning how to transfer someone in a Hoyer lift. And I thought, and the fact that the ALS Association got us a Hoyer lift so that we could help transfer my husband. But I think that there's an education piece of this to me when it comes to caregivers. I think that with a relatively small investment to support our caregivers, there is a huge financial return on that for the state. Because of course, all of us would like to care for our loved ones as long as we possibly can. If there is any way that we can care for our loved ones, we want to do that. That is our goal. That is our desire. But sometimes we just need a little bit of support to be able to do that. And so, the examples that I would use are, I was always very frustrated. I happened to be a nursing assistant through college. That's what I did. So I was familiar with caring for people. I wasn't afraid of it. And my husband chose to be on a ventilator. And when he had his trach placed, Medicare would pay for 3 full months in an elevated acute care hospital for that transition, but they would not pay for a single home health visit. Well, I didn't need my husband to go to the LTAC. I could care for him, but having that relatively minimal support of maybe a daily or even weekly home health visit would have made a big difference for our family. And Marianne talked about, we had a conversation yesterday about some of the things they're looking into to do with the support money for caregivers. And one of those things is training for caregivers. Like I said, I happen to be a nursing assistant. And so I knew how to change the sheets on the bed while my husband was in it. I knew how to safely help my husband to the floor when he began to fall. I knew how to help him safely fall. There's so many things that if caregivers just had a little bit of support, a little bit of training, we could do such a better job of caring for our loved ones, and frankly, with a financial benefit to the government and to other taxpayers, because they don't necessarily need the level of care from outside of our home if we've got that support inside of our homes.
I think you bring up an extremely important point that taking care of ALS patients, their families, their caregivers is not just the right thing to do, but it really boils down to being good public policy. And I think that's where we as an association are going and we as a community are going and are so excited about the work that we're going to be doing going forward. I wish I could spend all day with the three of you. This has been such a great discussion. And thank you all for being with us today. We will certainly be coming back to you to seek your advice as we move forward with similar work, hopefully in other states who will do exactly what you've done. So congratulations to you all. And thank you again for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now we're going to move. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Richard Bedlack. He is well known to many of you, and he is here today to talk about his work in optimizing treatments and care for people with ALS through multidisciplinary care and telehealth. He is a professor of neurology at Duke and director of the Duke ALS Clinic. He has won awards for teaching and patient care and has been a recipient of ALS research grants, participated in ALS clinical trials, and published more than 100 ALS articles. Thank you, Dr. Bedlack. We're thrilled to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Melanie. It's great to be with you here in Durham, North Carolina, where it's 95 degrees and I'm wearing a velvet jacket for some reason. That might have been a mistake this morning when I got up. But as you heard, I was asked to speak to you about multidisciplinary team care and telemedicine, which I believe are foundations of optimal ALS care in this day and age. Next slide, please. And just as Dr. Benatar started out with his disclosures, I'll start out with mine. I do have research support from the ALS Association, from Medicine Nova and Orion, as well as the Healy Center. And I have consulting support from several different companies. I work with these companies on data safety monitoring boards to try to optimize the safety of people in their trials. I also work with them to try to design more patient-centric protocols. And finally, I've got some book royalties that come from Springer Publishing, and I'll tell you about that book that I wrote in a little while. Next slide. So the outline for my talk, I'm going to start out just by showing you how much ALS care has evolved since I started in this field. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of multidisciplinary team care, what it is, proof that it helps, some challenges that I see with it, and some opportunities. And then we'll do the same thing with telemedicine. We'll define it for those of you that haven't tried it, show you how much it can help in ALS care, show you where some of the challenges are and where I think there are opportunities for meeting those challenges together through education and advocacy. Next slide. So I had my first encounter with ALS, believe it or not, 23 years ago when I was still a resident here at Duke University. And you can tell this picture comes from the 90s because I had the Jerry Seinfeld haircut back then. And also because the 90s were the only era of my life when I wore blue blazers. Duke's a pretty conservative place, and I was trying not to stick out too much during my residency, just stay low and get through it. But I'll never forget that day, that encounter, how amazed I was by the person's story and by the collection of findings I saw on their neurological exam. And I'll also never forget how horrified I was when my attending that I was learning from came in and said, well, we know what this disease is called, but we don't know why it happens. People with this disease will become rapidly disabled. They will survive only 2 to 3 years. And there's really nothing we can do about it. You just have to go home and get your affairs in order. And then he just walked out. And I remember how bad I felt. If I felt that bad, how bad did that patient and family feel? And I laid awake that night and said, you know, this is what I'm going to spend my career trying to fix. I'm going to try to focus on this disease and create a program that gives people with this disease options for living the best life they can, and a research program that gives them some hope. Next slide. And I'm happy to say that things have changed a lot over the 20 plus years that I've been involved in this field. Because of the efforts of many people all over the world, there are now literally hundreds of different options for people with this disease: medication options, equipment options, exercise options, diets and supplements. There are entire books written about all these options, including the one I mentioned earlier, which needs to be updated. It was published in 2013. The American Academy of Neurology in 2013 summarized all these options into what they thought were the most evidence-based ones. These are the 11 so-called ALS quality measures. And you can see them on the right side of this slide. At the very start, there's multidisciplinary team care. The second one is disease-modifying pharmacotherapy. The third is cognitive and behavioral impairment screening. The fourth is symptomatic treatments. The fifth is respiratory insufficiency is queried. The sixth is NIV treatment, non-invasive ventilation treatment for those who have respiratory insufficiency. The seventh is screening for dysphagia and weight loss and impaired nutrition. The eighth is offering nutritional support. The ninth is communication support. The 10th is end-of-life planning assistance. And the 11th is falls querying. Next slide. So although there are these hundreds of options, there's some challenges to getting people with ALS connected to all of them. The first challenge is that ALS is a rare disease, and most clinicians are not going to see very many cases of it in their careers. And as a result, they're not going to know about all these options. And the second is that this disease can change very quickly, and it can impair multiple body parts, multiple functions over just a short period of time. It can move so fast and with such fury that it's virtually impossible for just one clinician to keep up with it. Next slide. And this is why multidisciplinary teams are so important. So multidisciplinary teams are defined as teams that have an ALS neurologist and at least two of the following specialists: pulmonologists, gastroenterologists, physiatrists, social workers, occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech therapists, psychologists, respiratory therapists, genetics counselors, palliative care specialists, nurses, dietitians, and dentists. And I would say that most of the multidisciplinary ALS teams in this country have most of the people on that list, not just two, but most. You could see a picture of what my Duke ALS team looks like in that picture over there. We currently have 20 different clinicians representing almost every one of the specialties on this list. Next slide. So how does it work? Well, if you decide to attend a clinic with a multidisciplinary team, you will get to see at least one team member from each of the different disciplines. And how does billing work? Well, the providers on the team who are not grant funded will bill you separately. And over the course of multiple hours of seeing these different team members, many measurements will be made. Each person on the team has a certain set of measurements that they make. And as a result, if we see that those measurements are changing, that ALS is trying to take some important function away, you will be presented with a lot of evidence and experience-based options. And what I've seen here at Duke is now at the end of a day, people with ALS will leave our clinic with a long list of things they can do about the disease. And again, those could be medications, they could be equipment, exercises, nutrition, research options. There could be options we empower them to understand when it comes to self-experimentation. There could be options as far as participating in advocacy or fundraising. Next slide. So, I mean, this is a huge endeavor, obviously. What's the evidence that it actually has benefits for people with ALS? Well, there are now several published studies comparing the course of ALS in people who are attending multidisciplinary clinics to the course of those who are cared for in a more traditional single provider setting. And to summarize all those studies, attendance in multidisciplinary clinics is associated with more equipment, better quality of life scores, fewer hospitalizations, and significantly longer survival. There are some studies showing that people who attend multidisciplinary clinics live more than a year longer than people who do not. Next slide. But it's not easy. These are very resource and time intensive. They lose money for the institutions. One study suggested that less than half of the costs of running a clinic like this are covered by insurance. Besides the financial costs, there are physical and emotional costs for both the people with ALS who attend and for the clinicians. We're going to make a lot of measurements. Sometimes those measurements are going to be worse. Sometimes they're going to force us to present options which are not pleasant, they're difficult. There's also not enough of these clinics, and they're not geographically dispersed. They tend to be concentrated on the coasts. They tend to be concentrated around large cities. Most people with ALS live more than 50 miles from the nearest multidisciplinary clinic. And we know that it becomes more challenging to travel as the disease progresses. Next slide. So what are some potential opportunities? Well, these clinics would not exist without funding from patient advocacy groups like the ALS Association. In fact, the ALS Association is the main sponsor for the majority of multidisciplinary ALS clinics in the United States. And so when we talk about fundraising, it's important to understand the importance of the dollars that go to supporting these clinics. Again, I believe these are the very foundation upon which research is built, these multidisciplinary clinics. And so we've got to be able to support them, otherwise they will fall apart. Ultimately, we'd like to see billing codes at a federal level for multidisciplinary ALS care and codes that are reimbursing clinicians for the value of care. Like, for example, how many quality measures did you accomplish in that visit rather than the time spent? Currently, our billing codes are based on the time that we spend with people, and they only go up to a certain amount. I think it's 80 minutes for a new patient and 60 minutes for a return. And very often I spend more than 2 hours with a new patient. We got to make sure that these clinics have mental health and counseling services. And ideally, those would be for the people who attend the clinic, but also for the people who work there. And honestly, these can be provided by so many different individuals. So in my clinic at various times, we've had psychologists and psychiatrists. Right now, we provide mental health and counseling with our nurse practitioner and with our social worker. We've got to find creative ways to stimulate hope, altruism, and resilience in our patients, but also in our staffs. And in my clinic for patients, I can do this by stressing the variability of the disease, both between and also within individual patients at different times, by stressing all the things we can do about the disease, by stressing the progress that we're making and all the exciting things that are happening in our research studies. And for my clinicians on my team, I stimulate these things by having journal clubs where I can bring them up to date on the latest exciting findings, by bringing them with me to meetings, and by having events. In fact, even during the pandemic, we were able to have events together. We did something called Fashionably Fighting ALS, where we would all dress in a theme once a month. And it really creates a lot of resilience and optimism in the team. And I think there's an opportunity to bring this model to people who cannot travel through telemedicine. Next slide. So telemedicine is defined as the exchange of medical information between patients and clinicians who are in different places without either one needing to travel. And it typically involves the use of technology, and that technology, like everything else, is rapidly evolving. So you can see a picture here of what people in the early 1900s thought telemedicine would look like. It really doesn't look anything like that now. People most often connect with their doctors now by their iPhones. But of course, there's lots of different ways they can do that. There's variability in where participants can be. So I've actually done telemedicine visits where I'm in my home and my patient is in their home as well. Neither one of us has to actually be in an office to do this. There's variability in terms of the timing. I think the most useful type of telemedicine is synchronous, meaning that both the doctor and the patient are on the call at the same time. But there are some clinics that use something called store and forward telemedicine. They actually have the patient record their answers on different outcome measures, and then clinicians can look at those later and provide feedback. Most commonly, we do single provider telemedicine, but some of us are starting to offer multidisciplinary telemedicine where many of our different clinicians can get on with the patient at the same time. There's also a lot of different options in terms of measurements, and this is, again, very rapidly evolving. When I first started it, the main measurement we could make was the ALS FRSR score, but people are now starting to validate even pulmonary function tests that we can do through telemedicine. Next slide. So how do you do it? Well, hopefully most of you have done it, but if not, the first thing you want to do is check with your doctor to see if they offer this. And if they do, which most of us do now, they'll offer you a step-by-step instruction. There'll be typically a helpline you can call or a link you can use to connect with a team that can help you if you get stuck. Typically, your instructions are going to start by you downloading a program like Zoom or MyChart or Extended Care. And then you will get a link from the doctor's office when it's time to do the telemedicine clinic. You just click on that link and it opens up a window and you'll be able to see and hear the doctor just like you're seeing and hearing me right now. Next. And as we said, there's going to be a link. When you click it, you'll see and hear them. It's really surprisingly easy. If you haven't tried it before, don't be intimidated. There's a lot of ways that you can get help. And if all else fails, sometimes my initial calls with someone will fail. we'll just convert it over to a phone call, and we can get a lot of information that way too. Next slide. So there's a lot of proof now that telemedicine works. So even within ALS, now people are starting to publish surveys of patients and providers, and the satisfaction scores are really high, almost as high as they are with an in-person visit. There are surveys coming out now that show that we can provide many of the same options to people with ALS via telemedicine as we can by an in-person visit. As you can see from this small study that was done in the Cleveland VA Medical Center, the quality of care as measured by how long people live and how fast their ALS FRSR progresses seems to be at least as good in a telemedicine clinic as it is in person. And this one is really quite surprising and I think important. There's a tremendous cost savings. The folks at MGH have shown that patients can save almost $1,000 per visit by working with telemedicine, and the healthcare system can save over $300 per visit by converting these in-person visits over to telemedicine. Next slide. But there's challenges. A lot of us feel uncomfortable seeing new patients by telemedicine because we can't lay our hands on them. We can't do the kind of detailed neurological exam that we can do in person. Also because that first visit tends to be pretty emotional for both the provider and for the patient and family. And I still feel like, that in-person visit, that connection that we get from being in the same room is better than it is through a video. There's challenges with regard to billing. We never could bill for telemedicine, most of us. And then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden it became real easy. And now as the pandemic has receded, billing is becoming a lot more complicated again. And in particular, it's becoming virtually impossible for some of us to bill across state lines. So what I've shown on this slide right here is that several states have something called an interstate medical license compact, which means it's easier for doctors who want to cross those state lines to get a license in all those states, but it's still a lot of work. My state is not included in that, which means I would have to apply for that license just as if I wanted to go and practice in person in all those different states that I want to see patients. And that's pretty frustrating. Next slide. So what are some opportunities? Well, oftentimes I hear stories about new patients waiting many months to see an ALS expert. I see no reason why we couldn't offer new patients education-only visits where we were not assuming care, but we were educating them about some of the options that are available. And in fact, there's a company out there who's doing this called Sumis Global. I think we really need to advocate to preserve and even extend billing codes for telemedicine in ALS. It brings such tremendous value in a rare disease like this, where there's so many special options that most doctors don't know about. And I think we have to advocate to at least expand this interstate medical licensure compact to involve all 50 states. Even better would be to do something called reciprocity, where if you had a medical license in a state, other states would recognize it, or just make medical licensing something that happens at the federal level, not at the state level, so that a doctor who's licensed at the federal level can see patients in every state. Next slide. So just to kind of summarize, I've shown you there's a lot of evidence and experience-based treatment options for people with ALS now, a lot more than we had when I first started. And I think the best way to offer these to people is by using multidisciplinary team care and by offering telemedicine for folks who can't travel. Multidisciplinary team care ensures the most comprehensive assessment of the effects of the disease on a person and their family, and it allows us to provide the most options, and it's associated with the best outcomes. And telemedicine can improve access to experts, and it's shown to improve satisfaction and costs. There are challenges to these two things, but I believe that together we can overcome these through education and advocacy. Next slide. So just want to say thanks to all the people out there living with ALS. As I've said many times at the end of my talks, You are the reason I get up out of bed every day and work as hard as I do. You inspire me, and I want to keep finding new options for you. Thanks to the patient advocacy groups, in particular, the ALS Association, for sponsoring all the things that I do, my multidisciplinary clinic, my telemedicine program, a lot of my research. Thanks to my collaborators around the world, and especially to my Duke ALS team. Again, I think they helped me build a foundation of great patient care upon which all my research is based. So I'm happy to take questions now.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Bedlack. We do have a couple questions coming in, so appreciate you giving some time and a little bit extra for us today. You mentioned multidisciplinary clinics and the importance of forming a connection with them. Do those clinics offer opportunities or information on clinical trials and opportunities to be in them?
Yeah, great question. So I would say that most of the clinical trials that happen, at least in the United States, happen in the multidisciplinary clinics. It's rare to see a clinical trial being offered in a private practice setting. I do know of a few private practices that do them, but the vast majority happen in multidisciplinary clinics. And so not only will you be going to a place where there are research studies available, but you will also be seeing a neurologist who's passionate and up to date as far as all the options, including the research options.
Yeah, thanks for that. Another question about clinical care. Does respiratory intervention early in the disease, has that been shown to have better clinical outcomes later in the disease?
Yes. And that's part of the reason why, again, I think it's so important to have a respiratory therapist on the team. In our clinic, we not only measure pulmonary function tests, but the respiratory therapist shows people how to do respiratory muscle training exercises, which are looking, better and better as far as a way to slow the rate of decline on the forced vital capacity, and also maybe to preserve speaking and swallowing functions as well.
You talked a lot about telehealth and telehealth visits and some of the outcomes and how we see, the quality is there. A couple questions here, I'm trying to consolidate in the interest of time. As we start to move into a post-COVID, or we're learning how to live with COVID, getting back into clinics, talked about expanding telehealth. How can somebody make a determination? How's the determination going to be made when I should take a telehealth visit, when I should go in person?
Yeah, so I can tell you how we do it in our clinic. So patients who are doing well, like I have some people who are hardly changing, those would be people that I would check in periodically with telemedicine and maybe not see them in person as frequently. Someone who's changing quickly, I think it is kind of important for them to try to make it in person to the multidisciplinary clinic, because there's still no substitute, in my opinion, for all the hands-on measurements that we can make and all the demonstrations that we can do. I mean, demonstrations of equipment, for example, we can have somebody who's starting to fall, walk with different kinds of walkers up and down our halls. We can't do that through telemedicine. So I still think for people who are changing rapidly, in person makes more sense. But we do see that sometimes people are challenged by travel. And certainly I think connecting with people through telemedicine is better than not connecting with them at all. So that's how we make the determination in our clinic. We first try to get people with more rapid progression to come back frequently in person, people who are doing well by telemedicine. But anybody who's challenged from a travel perspective, we try to offer multidisciplinary telemedicine to them.
A patient's mental state, attitude, resilience, et cetera, is fundamental to the quality of their post-diagnosis ALS life. What are you doing to assist the patients with that?
Yeah. And again, I mentioned, I think that's one of the most important things that we do in telemedicine is look out for that. So I try to stimulate hope first by explaining the reality of the variability and progression with this disease. When most people get diagnosed, they think about the average person with this disease. They think about that statement that my attending made during that first case that I saw with them, which is, you have 2 to 3 years to live. Well, there's a tremendous variability. I mean, I've seen 3,500 patients with this disease. I've seen some that only lasted a few months with it, but I've seen others that have been with me for 20 years. I've even seen a small handful of people who appear to recover from the disease. So I explained to patients the first day I meet them, look, this is sort of what happens on average, but that doesn't mean it's going to be you. There's no way I can look into a crystal ball and know exactly what you're going to look like in 6 months or 6 years. Let's try to make you the best you can be today. We're going to present you with a lot of options, things you can do, and then we'll bring you back in a few months and see if anything's changed. And if it hasn't, we'll start stretching out those follow-up intervals. I think there's also a lot of hope, that comes from talking about research, and not only talking about research to people who are obvious candidates for clinical trials, but making sure that everybody understands the exciting things that are happening, even if they're at a very far advanced stage in the disease. There's always benefits that come from talking about research breakthroughs. There's always benefits, in my opinion, that come from talking about some of the exciting things we've written about on ALS Untangled, things that patients can try on their own when they're not candidates for research studies. So to me, I mean, that's how I try to keep patients, hopeful in this disease.
I'm going to try to sneak in one more before we have to let you go. As the disease progresses, what are options for those that do not have family caregivers?
Yeah, that's always really one of the toughest ones. And as has already been pointed out, options for getting people the kind of home care that they need are still extremely limited. And it's another area where we need more advocacy. I had no idea before I started just how bad insurance reimbursement was for the kind of home care that people with this disease need until I started seeing these deficiencies myself. And so, it oftentimes comes down to trying to find caregivers where you can hire them out of pocket, or finding places where your loved one can go and live with the disease. And although there's starting to be a few of these places that are really knowledgeable and excellent with ALS care, that's the vast majority of them are not. The vast majority of long-term care clinics don't know anything about ALS and are not very good at taking care of people with it. So lots of room for improvement through advocacy, I think, in this area.
Dr. Bedlack, could stay here with you talking about this stuff for an hour. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we do have to move on, but thanks so much for your time and for sharing all this with us today.
Sure.
Joining us next with a legislative update about telehealth is Denise Balin, Director of Government Affairs and Policy for the ALS Association.
Thank you. First, I feel very underdressed after following Dr. Bedlack, but that's not a bad thing. I think Dr. Bedlack already shared a lot of information about telehealth, which is very helpful. So let's continue that discussion. Next slide. So to set the tone, one more slide, please. To set the tone of this panel, I wanted to share with everybody the basics of telehealth, which I believe Dr. Bedlack also shared what it means. I think most of us, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, were using telehealth in some manner, emailing or calling your doctor for advice. But telehealth certainly expanded during COVID, since it provided us a way to remain in contact with your care team. So, and because it was a necessity to use telehealth during the pandemic, the government gave a temporary expanded telehealth coverage in Medicare during this time. So let's talk about what telehealth means to someone living with ALS. And joining me is Dr. Joel Shamaskin. Some of you may already know about Dr. Shamaskin and his ALS journey. He spent 30 years as a primary care physician, taking care of countless patients. And he's here today to share his insights as a provider and as a patient into telehealth. So Dr. Shamaskin, can you please share your thoughts and experience with telehealth?
Thank you, Denise. In 30 years in primary care medicine, I never conducted a virtual office visit. They just weren't being done in my area. But in over the 6 years since my diagnosis, I've come to understand the importance of telehealth in ALS care. In preparing to join you today, I've spoken with colleagues, including my own neurologist, and I want to share what I've learned. The key concept guiding my thinking in our drive to extend telehealth is on my only slide. Slide, please. Anyone, anywhere is a phrase I'm borrowing that's a guiding principle shaping how academic centers are improving telehealth for patient care and research. If we as patients think about our present and future needs with these words in mind, we can then effectively personalize our messages. Slide down, please. We're all very sensitive to the importance of avoiding a delay in ALS diagnosis. Initial visits are key to accurate and timely decision-making. In-person interaction is hard to replace at that point in one's care. But beyond that, when our neurologist knows us well and things are changing slowly, telehealth can be invaluable to those of us with seriously impaired mobility or need for ventilatory support. End-of-life care can be an especially important time for telehealth visits. As my neurologist put it, avoiding the tyranny of the office visit for patients has been a priority for him. Breaking check-ins into more frequent, shorter visits has been a godsend for them. Caregivers or family members who might not be able to mobilize for an office visit can participate virtually. Doctors do their best when getting real-time input from all family members who are concerned. And finally, there's value in seeing us in our homes if questions arise related to safety concerns. Where I live, there are major healthcare access inequities related to poverty and race. Telehealth can help people in those groups with ALS and other diseases gain access and overcome barriers to care, such as family needing to take time off from work, paying for or arranging transportation. That is, of course, if they have their digital health readiness needs met. So in conclusion, I want to see a world where anyone with ALS like me can receive excellent care and participate in research anywhere. And I'll add anytime permanently into the future. Thank you. Back to you, Denise.
I think that is great advice from you. I just need to video record that and send that up to Capitol Hill right now. So if you can go to my next slide. So I think Dr. Shamaskin truly went over all the reasons why telehealth is an important part of our own care. Like you said, it provides you with more access, reduces needs to travel, changes in your care plan can be made faster. It helps patients who don't live close to their care team talk to them. And it also even allows you flexibility to choose on who's on your care team as well. So if you choose to use telehealth, we here at the ALS Association want to make sure it's available to you in the future. So can we go to the next slide? So the next step is to lobby Congress. That's what we need. That's what we need to do. We need to tell them that telehealth is essential for people living with ALS. And why do we have to reach out to Congress? It's because Congress has until mid-December to vote on covering telehealth in Medicare beyond the public health emergency. It ends in mid-December. So if they don't vote on it, it won't be covered under Medicare. And that means your provider won't be reimbursed for your telehealth visit. And as Dr. Shamaskin said, it's been very helpful to providers to provide these services and to keep in touch with their patients. But of all the legislative issues out there on Capitol Hill, telehealth is very bipartisan, which is great. I mean, even today, this morning, I spoke with a congressman's office who agreed with extending telehealth in the future. The congressman, who's from a rural area, uses it himself and sees the need and benefit of having better access to healthcare. So even though it's bipartisan, there is no current agreement on how to do that on Capitol Hill. That's because, I mean, there are concerns from Congress that it could be too costly, even though Dr. Bedlack has shared a study on that. It might be overused, making it too costly. Maybe there could be a possibility of fraud, waste, and abuse. So they need to hear from you on this issue. Next slide, please. So the ALS Association has endorsed a few bills on this issue of telehealth. We've endorsed the Connect Act, which will make telehealth in Medicare a permanent part of the Medicare program. And we've also endorsed the TREAT Act to increase access to care for you. So you can be treated by a clinician who might not reside in your state and isn't licensed there. So, but there's about 40 other telehealth bills out there too. So Congress is going to continue to debate this issue, try to come up to an agreement before the deadline of mid-December this year, so that we can continue to help people that want to use telehealth. So now that we've provided an overview of telehealth, I'm going to pass the virtual stage back over to Melanie Ledmall.
Thank you so much, Denise. So before we end our session today, I'm going to ask you to take action to make sure Congress knows how important telehealth is to the ALS community. So again, I'm going to ask you to do something that I'm sure you rarely get asked to do in conferences and events like these, and that's take out your cell phone and scan the QR code on your screen. You do that by opening the camera app on your phone. Hold your phone so that the QR code appears in the view. Tap that notification to open the link for the QR code, and then the QR code will take you directly to our action center where you can complete today's action. Thank you again to each of our speakers and to each of you today for joining us. Due to our technical difficulties yesterday, we are going to repeat some of the programming that was missed yesterday and do invite you to stay if you would like. If you can't, we do understand, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow for the final day of our 2022 National ALS Advocacy Conference. Our programs will kick off at 3 p.m. Eastern, but note, we'll offer extended programming at the end of tomorrow's session as well, and hope you can join us. For those that will be staying with us, we know it has been a little bit of a while sitting or standing, whatever the case may be. So we're going to take a 10-minute break and we'll resume right back here in another 10 minutes. So we'll see you all soon. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And thank you to all of those staying with us tonight. Joining us once again is Chief Mission Officer Dr. Neil Thacker, who will give us an overview of the conference focus. Take it away, Neil.
Thanks, Melanie. So I wanted to talk to you, if you can pull up my slides, please, about this theme we have to make ALS a livable disease. So if we go to the next slide, what we mean is, again, a rapid and fundamental transformation in what it is to have ALS, what it is to live with ALS, until we can find a cure. Recognizing that all of the treatments that are in the pipeline right now aren't quite the cures we're looking for, but they do seem to have potential to have benefit, to extend life, to improve quality of life. And so let me just walk through for you what we mean when we say livable disease. If you go to the next slide, please. So part of this fundamentally different experience is a dramatically longer life. People just live a lot longer, as close to a normal lifespan as possible. And to get there, we need more life extending treatments. And then, as Dr. Bedlack was talking about, people need to be able to access those treatments and access all the care and support it takes to make those treatments really work together and work together in combination. And if you can go to the next slide, please. It's also about improved quality of life. And when we talk about that, this is, of course, an inherently personal issue. And that's why autonomy is so important. It's quality of life as the person with ALS defines quality of life. It's their decision how they want to live their life, how they want to spend their time, and to see engagement in the forms of activity that is most meaningful to them. It could be a volunteer in their community. It could be as an employee. It could be working with their family. It could be as a pet owner, whatever's important to them. And then, of course, all the burdens that come along with ALS, the physical pain, emotional stress, and financial burdens as well. If we go to the next slide, please. And then we want to think about very deliberately about reducing the risks for ALS for loved ones. If you have ALS, the reasons why you have it are shared with people that you know and people that you care about. They could be familial, genetic issues. They could be environmental exposures, which were shared by people you grew up with or people you served with. So part of what we're doing, as you saw from Dr. Benatar's work, is we're starting to build out that research agenda. The National Registry is a fundamental part of that issue. The work that Dr. Benatar and others are doing are fundamental to that. But also to be ready for when genetic treatments become available. And so we're working on expanding genetic counseling and testing. So if you have a genetic marker, which means you can have an easier time getting into a clinical trial that might help, or when that treatment becomes available, you'll have an easier time being able to access that treatment. So if we go to the next slide, please. So, I've been sort of mixing up what it is that we want. We want longer lives, improved quality of life, and reduced risk and harms of ALS. And then the things that we're going to do to get there, how we're going to make that happen. And that's what we're talking about throughout this conference, because there's an advocacy role as well as a research and a care role. And the association is deeply embedded in all those activities. And so one of the things we have to do is find new treatments and cures. And we'll see a talk from Dr. Paganoni tomorrow talking about new treatments and cures. We need to optimize the care and treatment that we have. And we saw a great presentation from Dr. Bedlack talking about that, Dr. Shamaskin talking about access, and also the importance of assistive technology and how that can play an important role in autonomy and engagement as well. And then we need to keep thinking and working hard about preventing the actual incidence of ALS, or as Dr. Benatar was talking about, treating people as early as possible with the idea that we may be able to delay or even halt the progress of disease, so people have a much, much, much longer time living and functioning than they would without those early treatments. And then, as you'll hear from Dr. Hyman Patterson tomorrow, there's also a lot we can do specifically through great care to prevent some of the harms and complications associated with ALS. So these themes suffuse throughout our conference, and I've been talking about them just now in scientific terms and in clinical terms, but they're really cannot happen without the work of all of you for advocacy, because we require the government to fund this research. We require the government to help support these activities. If we go to the next page, please, to provide better benefits, to provide for things that are not health related, but are related to quality of life, to provide health insurance to make sure people can get the treatment that they deserve. And then also what's really important, and the reason why we have this plan, is to help our government understand that there's a degree of focus and urgency that has to happen here. It's not just fund all the research that's related to the brain. It's funding research that's going to lead to treatments that are going to change the lives of people with ALS who are living with ALS today. That time element has to be there. And so I'm really glad that you've been able to stick with us throughout the whole day. We have a little bit more to be more focused on that advocacy agenda, because this really has to be a group effort. And as you've seen already, the ALS community is capable of great things when we do work together. So I will stop there, and I believe turn things back to, looking at my schedule here, back to Melanie, I think.
Thank you so much, Neil. So as you know, we are going through a period of change right now at the association. So I wanted to take a moment to share our plans and priorities, not just now, but moving forward. Slide, please. Our overall strategy is based on 3 specific principles: ensuring that all of our legislative work supports our overarching policy goals, ensuring that we take advantage of opportunities to engage and provide leadership, and ensuring that we are participating and engaging in the work of our other patient advocacy coalitions. Our goal, as you've previously heard, is to make ALS livable by 2030. Slide, please. So in order to do that, we are going to be deploying and will deploy a multi-pronged strategy that pulls at all of the levers that you see on your screen. So next slide. This is going to give you an idea of what this looks like at the federal level. And one of the things that you'll immediately see here is that we're going to be doing quite a bit of work to prevent or delay the harms of ALS. We believe, and we hope you agree, that ensuring that patients and their families have the support they need, physical, emotional, and financial, is critically important and work that we must do until we are able to find a cure. Slide, please. Now, at the state level, our work looks similar, and this is intentional. By working towards the same goals at the federal and state levels, we hope that we'll be able to achieve all of these results more quickly. We understand that this is urgent and that we simply cannot wait for the federal government to act, and that we must be pushing these policies at the state level as well. So now I would like to introduce you to 2 of my colleagues who will be taking a deeper dive into our work specifically at the federal level. That's Kathleen Sheehan, our Vice President of Public Policy, and Denise Balin, Director of Government Affairs and Policy.
Thanks so much, Melanie. Today has been so inspirational for me, and I hope it has been for you. We've heard from people living with ALS. We've heard from members of Congress. We've heard from state legislators. We've heard from researchers and physicians, and they all have the same message. We must work together to be sure that we can have the funding that we need to influence Congress to change laws to make life better. So advocacy is really key to all of our objectives in terms of what we're looking for. So with regard to finding new treatments and cures, federal funding must be increased. We all know that, and we have some very specific objectives that we're going after this year. And equally important, we want to be focused on discoveries that will improve the lives of people living with ALS today, as well as finding a way to end ALS for everyone. Next slide, please. Here's what we've done so far. with your help, and I want to thank everyone participating today for all that you've done to make this happen. Our advocates are really the key to mobilizing and to getting policymakers to take action. So we did a House and Senate Dear Colleague letters to support new funding for ALS. 138 representatives signed the letter in support, and 33 senators signed their letter. That letter goes directly to appropriators, and it says, we think ALS is important and you must fund it. Those letters are just so important. At the same time, our advocates have been extremely active. So they've sent nearly 8,000 letters to Capitol Hill, and they've also done more than 2,000 tweets to their members of Congress. Next slide, please. So what are we asking for? So we're asking for money at NIH. As you know, NIH is the biggest federal funder of ALS research, and we'd like to get a minimum of $135 million at NIH. We all want the Act for ALS to be fully funded. Under the law, it can be funded $100 million, and that would be $75 million for NIH's Expanded Access Program, and $25 million for FDA's new research, which is really intended to fast track clinical research and find treatments and cures quicker. For Department of Defense, we know that people living, people in the military are much more likely to have ALS, and that is why we want DoD to provide to have at least $60 million in funding from the Department of Defense for their research. The National ALS Registry and Biorepository is important for many reasons. It helps to track ALS, but most important, it invests in research and risk factors. And as you've seen, that is so critical to the research work that's being done at this moment. Next slide, please. The Act for ALS is a top priority for all of us, and here's what it does. So most importantly, it provides expanded access, experimental therapies for people living with ALS who are not eligible to participate in clinical trials. Equally important are the FDA grants. They're going to support the new development of drugs and new techniques and new methods to make research faster and more effective. The Act will also support public-private partnerships that will create new opportunities, bringing together government and corporations to work together. There's also going to be a dynamic ALS action plan, and we will be engaging all of you and getting your input on that action plan. The current funding for the Act for ALS this year is $27.5 million. 25 of that is going directly to expanded access, and 2.5 is going to the FDA. And we are advocating, as I said, for full funding this year. We want to be sure that program has all the funding it needs. Let me turn this over to Denise Balin, our Director of Government Affairs at this point.
Great. So in addition to funding research for new treatments and cures, the ALS Association is also focused on optimizing current treatments and care. So what does that mean? So a couple items that we're focusing on are when new drugs are available, we want to ensure that you have access to them and that these drugs are covered by your health insurance. But we also need these new therapies and cures for ALS to be available. So that's why we're working with other organizations on strengthening the FDA's Accelerated Approval Program. This program creates a pathway for new drugs to come to market. And on average, it's about 4.5 years faster than the usual FDA approval process. So we need the speed and urgency at the FDA for ALS. We need to make sure that when drugs are approved under the accelerated approval process, you have access to them and they're covered by your insurance. So as I discussed earlier today, telehealth has become an essential tool to access care during COVID, and it will be after COVID. So the ALS Association has endorsed the CONNECT Act, which will make telehealth permanent in Medicare, and the TREAT Act to increase your access to care and like I said, to be treated across state lines by clinicians that don't reside close by. Going to go to the next slide. Another mission pillar that guides our work is to prevent or delay the harms associated with ALS. That means we support policies that improve the lives of people living with ALS and their loved ones. So we support federal caregiving legislation because we know family caregivers are essential to an ALS care plan. We also want to know, what are the risk factors for ALS? What causes ALS? So that's why we're supporting funding for the National ALS Registry and Biorepository at the CDC, who are working on researching that topic. We've endorsed the Air Carrier Access Act. So this is the Americans for Disabilities Act for the air. We need to make sure that when you travel, especially to here in DC next year, that aircrafts are accessible to you. This bill will guide airlines to create new standards for individuals with disabilities and also allow you to file a complaint if you experience discrimination while flying. So some of you, as Kathleen said, that people that have served in the military are more likely to develop ALS. ALS is considered a service-connected disease, no matter when you serve. So that's why we work on a number of veterans issues for people living with ALS. We've endorsed the Justice for ALS Veterans Act. We want to make sure that surviving spouses and family members of veterans are treated fairly and receive compensation regardless of how long their loved one lived with ALS. So the ALS Association is working on these issues and many more. And with your advocacy, we can make a difference for people living with ALS. So now that you have an overview of some of our advocacy work the ALS Association is doing, I want to share a video from a member of Congress who is also doing the work for people with ALS on Capitol Hill. We're going to hear from Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, who she was gracious enough to stay with us yesterday and record her remarks in light of all the technical difficulties we had. So let's listen in.
We are now going to hear from the Honorable Jan Schakowsky. Congresswoman Schakowsky represents the Chicago area. She sits on the very important House Energy and Commerce Committee, and most importantly, she is an advocate like you for people living with ALS. Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, it's really a pleasure. I'm glad to be with you, even though it's more virtual than I had expected. But I was lucky to get to talk to your leadership while we were waiting for technology to catch up with us. So here I am. I just want you to know, I have been an organizer pretty much all of my life, trying to mobilize people. I'm a person who believes that what happens in Congress is very important, but what happens outside of Congress to make us act is even more important. And I was so proud to be an original sponsor of the Act for ALS, which, as you I'm sure know, was signed into law in December of 2001 with, almost unanimous support in the Congress. There aren't that many things these days that Republicans and Democrats get together on, but support for taking action to address your problems and our problems on ALS. ALS is certainly one of them. And we're learning that progress actually is being made, that there is more promising future in terms of the research into the drugs. There's better technologies to make life easier and better. And though ALS is actually a fairly uncommon disease, your advocacy has made such a difference in bringing resources together. I was a proud sponsor of the not legislation, but for the to make sure I signed the appropriations letter that says that there has to be greater appropriations that will go to ALS, and none of this would happen if those people like you did not make sure that you contact your legislators. I know that's going to be happening more next week, telling your story, personal story, being able to communicate, hopefully with members themselves, but if not, with staff, to see how important this is. I think most people these days know someone who has ALS. In any case, they know that right now, it's not a diagnosis that you want to hear, but that there is hope for the future. I have in my district just a fabulous advocate. Brian Wallach and his wife Sandra came to the Congress, and what they were doing was pressing the Food and Drug Administration to get more people in the trials, to make access to the promising drugs available to more people. Of course, that's the answer. The message that Brian and Sandra brought to the Congress is a message that you can bring when you talk to legislative offices and really make a difference. So I know that if we get the appropriations that we have asked for, that we're going to be able to move forward to make the progress that they need. A good friend of mine that I've known for many years has recently been diagnosed with ALS, and I want to bring him the good news too of what is being done and what can be done. So it's really about saying thank you, to keep up your fight. I like to end often when I talk on various different topics where ordinary citizens are, fighting for a cause. And that is to say, when we fight, and I believe that the kind of agenda that you have going forward is something that can become a reality, not on its own, but when you keep pushing. So thank you so much. I've gotten a great education through the months and years, learning more about ALS and learning more about the hope that is in the future. So let's just keep working. Thank you so much. Have a continued great conference. Have great calls next week when you start talking to your legislators. You can make the difference that needs to be made. Mwah! Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Schakowsky, for all the work that you are doing for people living with ALS and their loved ones. And now some questions. So thanks to everybody for sticking around. Some great questions coming in and looking forward to dive right in. I want to start with one that we actually got yesterday and again today. Why is the goal to make ALS livable by 2030? Why not set the goal earlier?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something we thought about really hard. If we set the goal that's too ambitious, then frankly, the scientific community gets scared and they turn away because it's just too much. They can't do it. So we want to do something that's realistic, but also challenging. And so what's important, I think, for us, for advocates, to realize is that timeline to 2030 started the moment we set it. And the moment we set it, we started to change our strategy to focus a lot more on the time to impact for our research programs and to talk a lot more about how to prevent the harms associated with ALS. These were things that we didn't really talk about before as an association. And I didn't hear that much conversation about it in the community. It conveys urgency in a way that the NIH can understand, hopefully in a way that Congress can understand, but it does mean that we have to change our behavior today, right now, and we've started to do that, and I hope you all can carry forward that message.
Talk about the need to treat ALS as soon as possible. And we got a question about how it's almost impossible to get into a trial. And if you're a slow progressor, no one is interested in seeing you. I've had ALS for 5 years. No one will give me a chance for a trial. Not a question, but maybe something that can spark some conversation.
Yeah, it's a great point. And there's two different dimensions to that. So one is what's the treatment options, right? And what you heard a little bit about from Dr. Bedlack today, and what you'll hear about more from Dr. Hyman Patterson tomorrow, is there is a lot that treatment can do. There is a lot we can do with the technology available to us today, but it is difficult. It is intensive. It does require lots and lots of specialists and that care to be coordinated. And there are complex financing issues and insurance issues that need to be worked through. I do encourage this person, if they haven't already, to go to our website or even the MDA and find an ALS specialty clinic and work with that clinic, because there may be things that we can do to help this person where they're at now, and then also help them plan for the future in ways that they may not realize is possible. And it is a dynamic situation. It is changing, even with the treatments we have now. Dr. Jinsey Andrews wrote a wonderful paper, I think a couple of summers ago, where she showed that the length of life that is observed from people on riluzole is increasing far beyond from the initial clinical trial results, decades ago. And that's because we're getting better at learning how to use these treatments. But the people who are the best at using these treatments are the folks like Dr. Bedlack that have seen thousands of people with ALS, and that there aren't that many places in the country that do that. We have 90 in our network, and then there are a few others in other treatment systems as well. So that's really important. The second part of that conversation, the question was about access to clinical trials. Clinical trials are experimental, and they can provide access to treatments, but by definition, we don't know that those treatments work. And so the fact that someone wants to volunteer to be in a clinical trial is a really wonderful thing. And even if they're not eligible for a clinical trial, there are other research studies they can participate in. And I think they should keep talking to their neurologist if they haven't been, about opportunities to participate in research. And we're working on some other ways to help people connect with research programs. And we do run a program on our website, rather through Neil's, that you can find through our website to connect to research programs.
Well, we led with this today. It's obviously top of mind for so many people. And so let's get into it. I'm in the United States. How can I get AMX35 from Canada? Do I need a Canadian doctor to prescribe it, or can I just request it from a Canadian pharmacy? You knew this question was coming.
That's a great question, and it's a complex legal situation. I will give a high-level answer, and then I'll turn it over to our attorney, Melanie, to get into more details. But the first answer is, right now, the drug is not available in Canada. It was just approved, and they have to go through their own process to get it covered and to get it on formularies and to work through distribution issues. So I don't know what the timing is, but it hasn't happened yet. Melanie?
Yeah, as Neil said, the legal situation is very unclear. The FDA does have some guidance for this on their website. And, if you go right to the FDA's website and Google this information, it is right there. They have a policy explaining that it typically does not object to personal imports of drugs that the FDA has not approved under certain circumstances. And we do believe, looking at this objectively, that an ALS patient qualifies under these circumstances. The drug, for example, is for use of a serious condition for which effective treatment is not available in the United States. Check. There is no commercialization or promotion of the drug to US residents. Well, we don't know that yet. We assume that will not be the case. The drug is considered not to represent an unreasonable risk. That is ALS Association's position. We believe that AMX 0035, we said it over and over again, is safe and effective. The individual importing the drug verifies in writing that it's for their own personal use. So you're not bringing it to the United States to resell it to other people. And then the last qualification is that generally not more than a 3-month supply should be brought in to the United States. One thing that I do think is important to mention here, though, is one of the reasons the FDA specifically does not really like the idea of Americans importing drugs from other countries that haven't been approved by the FDA is it's really tough to know whether that drug is the actual drug. There's a lot of fraud out there. And the last thing we want, the last thing any patient wants, is to end up taking something that's not the actual drug that you think it is. So this is a little bit of a slippery slope. We do understand why folks would want to try and obtain AMX 0035 from Canada until the FDA makes a decision. Hopefully that decision is a good one here. But there are some risks involved. So it is something that we encourage folks to take seriously and talk about at length and in depth with all of their physicians.
A great conversation earlier today with lawmakers and folks leading the fight up in the great state of Minnesota. Question about state advocacy. Do you have advocates in each state to help keep abreast of state legislation affecting ALS patients and their caregivers, and email lists, letters, which to notify us? What's the state of the fight in the states?
Good question, Jeremy. So I will say that the state of the fight in the states, as you say, is one that we are really beginning. We have really, as an association, focused much of our work at the federal level, and then worked with our chapters across the country to work on state advocacy. Now we're all coming together in our unified structure to work on all of this together. So our hope is that by working all together and harnessing the power of all of us, we will be able to achieve some of these results much faster at the state level, but also take on additional issues that we haven't worked on before. So we are really excited about what's to come as a result of this unification process that we're undergoing as an organization right now.
We got a question about familial ALS, hereditary ALS, but what about a person who is diagnosed with ALS and no hereditary significance at all, no genetic history? What's being done for that population?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is a lot. There are lots of different pathways to ALS that are under study right now that are in clinical trial. And so tomorrow, Kaldab Dave, the head of our research program, we'll be talking through that in detail. I think well, in very fast detail, I think the broader point for advocacy, from an advocacy perspective, is we do need to be researching the whole spectrum of ALS, all the potential causes and pathways for ALS, with the specific intention of generating those new treatments that we need to transform the ALS experience. So our message for NIH, our message to the DoD, our message to the FDA is we need new treatments, and we need them tested quickly, and we need them brought to market quickly. And that pressure for speed and for scale are really important. And familial ALS could have any number of pathways that are critical. And there also means that there are any number of opportunities for us to intervene clinically. So we have, as the Amylyx example shows, as the oral edaravone shows, there is a change happening in the ALS clinical space, and we need to keep going. We need to go faster.
Talk earlier about early diagnosis. Question about will funding be used to train primary care physicians and other medical staff on recognizing the signs and symptoms of ALS? And this questioner adds an observation. The ALS registry also needs to be required in all states so that cases can be tracked to determine potential causes, clusters, and more.
Yeah, those are great points. So let's take them apart a little bit. So the first question is, can we engage other physicians in the diagnostic journey so we diagnose people faster? And the challenge with ALS is it's so rare that lots of primary care physicians may go their whole career without seeing someone with ALS, even if they did diagnose them. And so for us to start to think about training hundreds of thousands of physicians for this rare, very rare event is a tough sell. It's tough to get them to pay attention to something they may never use. So we've been working with a group of ALS clinicians to develop a tool called Think ALS. I believe it's on our website, which is targeting not the primary care physician, but the physicians that they might refer to when they start getting symptoms they don't know how to manage. And so in this case, it's neurologists who aren't ALS specialists, who again don't often see people with ALS. And the idea is for them to think about ALS quickly, and then if it seems suspicious, to refer to an ALS specialist. This approach has had some success in the UK. We're trying it here, and then we're going to start to build out, not just think about diagnosing early, but also think about treating early, as Dr. Benatar said. I think that's the next evolution to this line of thinking. You had asked a second point about registries. Registries are really important. The National Registry is our best way to identify potential risk factors for ALS. And that comes not only through identifying people with ALS, but it comes through filling out those surveys, which are really long and take a lot of effort, because it requires people to go back in time and think about the exposures they might have had and the places they might have lived, so we can identify these exposures. The state registries aren't necessarily going to get us there very quickly, but that national registry is really important. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but in the past couple of months, they've changed their website. They've started doing estimates as well as counts. And so they've been a lot more inclusive than they have before. And they have a meeting this summer. It's going to be an open meeting. I'm hoping to hear some new information from them. But right now, they are the largest funder of prevention research and risk factor identification research in the US. And so that's a really important part of our research infrastructure, which is why it's part of our advocacy plan.
A question about emerging drugs. Are there any drugs available in expanded access programs currently, and how do we access them?
That's a good question, and I can think of several off the top of my head, but I don't have a comprehensive list. I think that your best option, if you're interested in a treatment for something that's experimental, is again to talk to your ALS specialist, because they'll have the best sense of not only what might be available, but what may be a good fit for you. Again, the issue with expanded access is, by definition, we don't know if the drug is going to have a benefit for you. So that's why I would always defer to an ALS specialist.
Well, I think that is going to have to do it for the Q&A, given the time constraints and in interest of everybody's time. But thanks to all our panelists for sticking around. And Melanie, I think I hand this one off to you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you again to everyone who stayed with us late tonight. As a reminder, our program is going to go long tomorrow. We look forward to seeing you again soon. So until then, everyone have a good night.
I think we did it. Thank you.